Everybody, welcome to IoTSF members and non-members, wherever you may be joining us from around the globe in several time zones. On the subject of non-members, before we get things going, non-members can join via IoTSecurityFoundation.org/join. This is the first today of IoT's monthly webinars. They're happening on the last Thursday of every month. So the next one will be on Tuesday, the 23rd of February, and I'll be announcing details on that a little bit later on. Look out for the first of our monthly newsletters as well coming soon. If you're not signed up to our mailing list, do drop me an email. It's chris.bennison@IoTSecurityFoundation.org, and I'll get you added to our mailing list so that you can receive the first of the monthly newsletters. Just to let everyone know, this webinar is being recorded today. And it will be uploaded to YouTube at some point next week. If you have any questions today or comments, there'll be a Q&A a bit later on in today's webinar. If you can ask a question via the chat function, and then I will come back to you during the Q&A section, and I'll be asking the questions in the order that they come in. Today's topics, which are separate and yet very much intertwined, we'll be hearing from Jonathan Angwin, and he'll be speaking about the UK's PSTI Act. Jonathan is a senior policy advisor working at the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sports. He is responsible for legislative interventions relating to the security of connectable products and has been working since 2020 to deliver Part 1 of the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act, which has been established as the world's first legislative framework mandating minimum requirements for consumer connectable product security. So we'll be hearing from Jonathan a little bit later on in today's webinar. This past Tuesday, IoTSF published the fifth in a series of reports on the subject of Consumer IoT Vulnerability Disclosure Policy Status. This individual research report monitors the security management behavior of consumer IoT product companies. The study reviewed the practice of 332 companies identified as selling IoT products for consumer and commercial uses such as appliances, routers, audio, smart home, lighting, mobile, tablets, and laptops. This is the fifth published report in the series plotting industry progress since 2018. With prior versions cited as evidence in global standards and regulatory processes. The desk-based research was carried out during the summer of 2022 by Copperhorse Limited, who are experts in mobile and IoT security, which brings me to today's first speaker. Rohan Panesar is a cybersecurity standards and policy specialist at Copperhorse Limited. He has worked with the company since 2021. Following the completion of a degree in economics. His dissertation focused on the economics of vulnerability disclosure. While at Copperhorse, Rohan has worked on projects including the annual report into the state of vulnerability disclosure and standards mapping websites for IoT and application security. He has also conducted varied research into topics including automotive cybersecurity standards, virtual kidnapping, and insecurity in third-party automotive head units. Rohan, a very warm welcome today. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. That was a great intro. Thanks. Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you basically about vulnerability disclosure, which I know if I did my dissertation on it, you can probably tell I'm quite into. So let me get started. Okay, so it's really great to be here today, and I'm going to be giving you a quick run through of the newly published IoTSF report into the state of vulnerability disclosure in consumer IoT in 2022. So this report was supported and sponsored by HackerOne, but we have complete authorship of the report itself. So the background of the report. So before we get into it, it's probably important to break down what vulnerability disclosure is. So vulnerability disclosure is the process by which a security researcher can report a vulnerability they have found in a product or service to the relevant organization. And this usually looks like a policy hosted on either an organization's website or through a third party. And this policy includes information on the best way to contact the relevant individual or team, as well as the best way to conduct that communication. So why did we start this research? The consumer IoT space has been exploding in recent years and will only continue to explode. And these devices have had historically poor security. We've all heard the horror stories like the Mirai botnet hijacking hundreds of thousands of IoT devices and the VTech hack, where the company failed at every step of the vulnerability disclosure process. As Chris mentioned earlier, this report is the 5th in the series published on the IoTSF website, and the report has been tracking approximately 300 of the most popular IoT devices found across global retailers. We conducted this research by visiting the websites of these retailers and selecting the top 10 most popular connected devices, and this group then made up the core of our data set. And while we've retained the core group of companies, we've added devices to this list to keep it updated as products are inevitably stop being sold, companies stop operating or switch products. In fact, in a previous year's report, we saw one company that sold generic smart devices on Amazon, like plugs or cameras, 1 year. And then the next year we came back to review it, it was selling party supplies like balloons. Also notably, we've had a small group of enterprise companies introduced to this research to illustrate the difference in vulnerability disclosure adoption between consumer IoT and enterprise IoT. So what we're looking for is a detectable vulnerability disclosure policy. And by detectable, so what we're doing when we're looking for a disclosure policy is we do what we think a researcher would do when looking for an organization's policy. We conduct a web search, we look around on their site, look at the top and the bottom, look for links for a vulnerability disclosure policy, as well as specifically looking for a security.txt file and a /security page. So in 2018, the original report found that only 9.7% of companies reviewed had a detectable vulnerability disclosure policy. So the headline figure this year is 27.11% of companies, or 90 of the 332 companies in our data set had a detectable vulnerability disclosure policy. So these are our previous year's findings. And as you can see, it's obviously trending upwards, which is great, but not trending upwards quickly enough. If the current rate of adoption continues, 100% use of vulnerability disclosure won't be achieved until around 2039. And while 100% adoption isn't what we're expecting or what's going to happen, 27% is just not good enough. And the rate at which companies are adopting vulnerability disclosure is far too slow. With incoming legislation mandating the use of vulnerability disclosure, this number will need to rise, and it will need to rise quickly. In 2020, a threshold test was introduced to our report to gauge the dataset's compliance with potential legislation. This test is twofold. The first part of the test being, does the organization have a vulnerability disclosure policy? And the second part of the test being, does the organization provide information on expected timelines for acknowledgement and resolution of the issues presented? And this second part can manifest itself as something in a policy, a line in the policy saying something like, we will reply to your report within 2 days, or we'll get back to you and we'll acknowledge your report within 2 days. So when this test was first introduced, of the 338 companies in the data set at the time, 274 of them would not pass either test. 64 of them, around 20%, would pass test 1, and only 4 companies, around 1% of the data set, would meet both tests. In 2021, this number, these figures were slightly better, with 68 passing test 1, which is around 22%, and 21 companies passing test 2, which is around 6% of the companies. And in 2022, these figures have gone up, with around 90% passing test 1, which is that 27% figure, and 34 companies passing test 2, which is only around 10% of our data set. And this next slide here shows the 34 companies that met test 2 in our 2022 report. So this year we conducted a dip test among the UK retailers that we included in our research, and these retailers being Amazon UK, Currys/PC World, and John Lewis. This test found that around 70% of the popular devices sold on UK retailers had a detectable vulnerability disclosure, and further had a detectable vulnerability disclosure policy. And furthermore, around 40% of this group would pass the second part of the threshold test. This is in stark comparison to our data set on the whole, which, as I said earlier, 27% with a detectable vulnerability disclosure policy and only 10.24% passing test 2. And while this wasn't an exhaustive piece of research, it may indicate that UK retailers stock the most popular IoT devices that may be of a higher quality and are often manufactured by large organizations that already practice vulnerability disclosure. This area is an area that Copperhorse will expand on in future reports, especially as the Product Security Telecommunications Infrastructure Act has received a royal assent. The use of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So during the research process, we found a couple of types of vulnerability disclosure being used. Those being coordinated vulnerability disclosure and non-disclosure. So coordinated vulnerability disclosure, or CVD, is the industry agreed upon standardized method of conducting vulnerability disclosure. And it essentially operates by the security researcher and vendor, which is the IoT device manufacturer, coordinating on identifying, rectifying, and eventually disclosure of a vulnerability. Non-disclosure, on the other hand, is where during the disclosure process, a security researcher is instructed that they are unable to disclose details of the vulnerability publicly. This year's research found that coordinated vulnerability disclosure usage was on the rise, and the use of policies that specifically reference non-disclosure are down. With this being said, though, the majority of companies in our data that do have a detectable vulnerability disclosure policy do not indicate one way or the other which type of disclosure they want to take part in and have been marked as NA in this data. So regional differences. 3 of the regions that have IoT device manufacturers headquartered within them are North America, Asia, and Europe. And we're choosing to look at these 3 regions specifically, as the other 3 regions in our data have a very small number of vendors headquartered in them, and none of these vendors use vulnerability disclosure. So of these 3 regions, Asia leads the pack with over 34% of companies headquartered in the region having a detectable vulnerability disclosure policy. North America is second with over 32% of companies, and Europe lags behind these other regions with only 14.47% of companies having a detectable vulnerability disclosure policy. And while all of these figures are too low, it's specifically concerning that Europe lags so far behind the EU, with the EU Cyber Resilience Act currently being drafted, which specifically mandates the use of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So this slide here just shows the breakdown of the product categories that we've captured in our data set. And this slide clearly shows that some categories drastically outperform others. So for example, here you can see that TV has 100% of the companies captured in this data having a detectable vulnerability disclosure policy, or Wi-Fi with over 80%. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, we have categories like leisure and hobbies with a 0%, lighting with 11%, and health, fitness, and well-being with just over 10%. And there are a few potential reasons for this vast difference. It could be due to something like sample size, or that some of these categories are largely occupied by big tech companies that are already preconditioned to be thinking about security. And in this product categories vein, this year's research saw some interesting newcomers to the data set. So one of these being Segway with their 9-bot connected scooter device, and Bellabeat with their smart water bottle. And neither of these companies use vulnerability disclosure. This year's additions to the data were actually pretty tame compared to some of the weird and wonderful smart connected devices that we've seen in previous years, but interesting nonetheless. So proxy disclosures and bug bounty. So proxy disclosure is where a vendor pays a third-party organization to host their policy for them. And bug bounties are where a vendor offers a reward for a security researcher that submits vulnerabilities to them. This year, we saw a slight increase on both fronts. And the 2 proxy disclosure organizations we've captured in our data this year are BugCrowd and HackerOne. But we are aware of other proxy disclosure companies out there operating. And from what I've seen, these proxy disclosure companies really engage with the security researcher community, as well as creating training and resources for hopeful hackers. But one thing that I do see time and time again in the research is pages that have seemingly become inactive. This is seen on these proxy disclosure sites as a well-organized policy that seemingly once been created by an organization and hosted through the third-party site, but now appears as provided by the community. This lack of clarity is something I'll expand on a little bit later. So other findings. So some of the other findings for this year's research were about contact methods and where policies are hosted. Firstly, we've seen somewhat of a dramatic decrease in the usage of PGP or GPG or public key encryption for contact, falling around 14% on last year's figures. We think it may be due to more organizations using secure web forms for submission of vulnerabilities, but we're unsure. So this may be an area that we look at in future reports. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, on every site, we look for a /security page for a place that a policy might be hosted. And additionally, we look for a security.txt file. This year saw a small increase on the percentage of companies using security.txt and or /security. So security.txt is a tool recommended by NCSC in their vulnerability disclosure toolkit. And it is essentially a bare bones text file that contains contact information and policy information for a given organization. However, one aspect of this tool that is sometimes overlooked is an expiry date. So clarity, or the lack of clarity, was an area I really wanted to discuss in the talking points section of this report. One thing that has become clear in all the research I've done surrounding vulnerability disclosure is that clarity can improve the efficiency of the vulnerability disclosure process. As mentioned in the proxy disclosure section, often when conducting this research, we would encounter policies that are in various states of apparent abandonment. And this led us to have some difficulty in ascertaining whether a particular organization has an active vulnerability disclosure policy. And if it's difficult for us to work this out, it's difficult for a researcher trying to contact them. Some of these pages on these proxy disclosure sites have a contact the security team button on them. But it's difficult for us to know whether, if you actually try to use this button to contact the security team, whether you'd get any reply and whether that's still looked at, that contact method. The IETF include an expiration date as a required element in the RFC related to security.txt. And this expiration date knows that the policy that they're looking at is still regularly maintained and is active. And in fact, during the research for this year's report, we looked at Facebook's security.txt file, and they had an expiration date of something like the 18th of November. And towards the tail end of the research, we'd actually passed this date. So we went back and looked, and Facebook had, lo and behold, updated their security.txt file. And like I said, this just shows researcher with a potential vulnerability in a Facebook system, that policy that they're looking at is still active. In fact, this screenshot here, by the way, is Bose's /security page, and they have a vulnerability disclosure policy. But when you go to the, at the time of research at least, when you go to the /security page on the Bose website, it returns a 404. But you can see by the URL, they used to have a policy hosted here, so a vulnerability disclosure policy here, or some vulnerability disclosure material hosted here. And this could lead to some kind of confusion for research. So I just wanted to put this screenshot, and I thought it was a good example of that. So incoming legislation. There are a few pieces of legislation being worked on around the world, and the one closest to home for me is the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act 2022, or PSTI, which received royal assent in early December. The next stages are still to be announced, but vulnerability disclosure will be an aspect of this law. And in fact, in an earlier stage, data from this research was used in Parliament. Also, the EU is currently in the process of drafting the EU Cyber Resilience Act. And the purpose of both these pieces of legislation is to improve the cybersecurity capabilities of devices sold in the country or region. The EU Cyber Resilience Act has a whole section on vulnerability handling, and one of the requirements being put in place and enforce a policy on coordinated vulnerability disclosure. Interestingly, this specifically mandates the use of coordinated vulnerability disclosure, which currently only around 18% of our data set would be compliant with. It'll be interesting to see how the EU identifies policies that are specifically coordinated vulnerability disclosure and whether they're able to do it at all. Also, the Network and Information Security Directive, or NIS2, exists, mainly to help secure critical infrastructure, but it also includes requirements around vulnerability disclosure. So that's all from me. Thank you all for listening. Let me run through the IoTSF report. You can go check it out on the IoTSF website. Here's my email address: is rohan.panesar@copperhorse.co.uk. Send me an email if you want to talk anything vulnerability disclosure and beyond. Thank you very much.
Rohan, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So a reminder, by the way, that if you have any questions or comments, there'll be a Q&A at the end of today's webinar. You can also ask a question via the chat function, or I can always ask it on your behalf. So next in today's webinar, we'll be hearing from Jonathan Angwin, speaking about the UK's PSTI Act. So Jonathan is a senior policy advisor working at the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. He is responsible for legislative interventions relating to the security of connectable products and has been working since 2020 to deliver part 1 of the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act, which has established the world's first legislative framework mandating minimum requirements for customer connectable product security. So Jonathan, welcome to today's webinar, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. I am just sharing my screen. That looks like that's gone through. So firstly, thank you very much to IoTSF for extending the invite to DCMS to talk to its members today. I'd just like to start my presentation by thanking IoTSF for the variegated forms of support that they have provided on the issue of consumer connectable product security for many years, whether it be through the development and publication of guidance on the implementation of the Code of Practice for Consumer IoT Security Guidelines, or whether it be John Moore contributing evidence towards the passage of the PSTI Act at the Commons committee stage, and also to Copperhorse for their invaluable work in not just this report, but more broadly in supporting both the development and the passage of the PSTI Act, with Professor David Rogers obviously providing evidence at Commons committee stage as well. So what am I going to be talking to you about today? So as Chris mentioned, the PSTI Act received royal assent towards the end of last year. I'm going to provide a quick overview of what that Act contains, as well as touching upon what is next and what secondary legislation will be required in order to bring it into force, and very high level comments about the timescales over which you might be able to expect that to happen. So I'll start off with an overview of the PSTI product security regime and what it contains. So it's a 2-measure bill. So the PS is product security, telecommunications infrastructure relates to measures that are supporting the rollout of gigabit broadband in the UK. So the product security regime in the PSTI bill, I'll talk first about its scope, then about the role of economic actors in the regime that it sets out, and then how it will be enforced, before moving on to talk about the initial security baseline that secondary legislation will set out before the regime comes into force. So all connectable products, whether that's internet connectable products or network connectable products as defined within the bill, that are made available to UK consumers, are within scope of the regime. This is there are some exceptions to this. So in the case of desktop computers, laptop computers, personal computers, as well as tablets without a ability to connect to a cellular network, government did not consider there was sufficient evidence at the point at which this measure was being introduced that the security issues that had been identified within consumer IoT products more broadly, and the market failures, which meant that things like ensuring the uptake of vulnerability disclosure policies had on the consumer IoT market applied to the same extent for those kinds of products, although this is an area which we are continuing to review evidence on. And we have powers within the bill in order to extend the scope of the regime to those products in the event that the government deems there to be sufficient evidence. There'll be also a number of other products that are accepted from the scope of the regime by virtue of the government undertaking other legislative interventions that cover the cybersecurity of those products. So this includes products such as medical devices, as well as automotive vehicles, additionally electric vehicle smart charge points, which is actually already subject to cybersecurity requirements under the EV charge point regulations 2022. So as I mentioned, all of those accepted products will be set out in secondary legislation as consumer connectable products, which the legislation doesn't apply to, but because they are being set out in secondary legislation as opposed to being defined on the face of the bill, it gives the government the flexibility to be able to update that exceptions list as necessitated by the evolving technology and threat landscapes. We have endeavoured throughout the development of the PSTI Act to ensure that it is maximally future-proofed and interoperable with other government interventions. What I was just discussing with respect to exceptions being a key example of that. Additionally, we have a variety of powers within the bill, which I'll touch on in a second, that ensure that the regime is maximally future-proofed and able to commensurately address what it is proportionate for government to legislate for, to ensure that consumers continue to be protected from the security risks presented by consumer connectable products. So I'll speak about the role of economic actors next. So the bill, now Act, sets out a number of duties that need to be complied with by manufacturers, importers, and distributors of products. These persons are defined in a very similar manner to how they're defined in wider product safety legislation to ensure that there is a maximally cohesive and coherent regulatory landscape. We also have within the bill the power to be able to set out security requirements in secondary legislation. So there's no mention of, for example, any requirement to mandate vulnerability disclosure policies be made available within the bill itself. However, the government has been very clear of the 3 initial security requirements that it intends to mandate, and this will be done through secondary legislation, again, in order to ensure that the regime remains maximally future-proofed over time. One of the eternal challenges of technology legislation in general, but especially technology security legislation, is the pace at which the threats, security, and technology and threat landscapes evolve, and how comparatively slow legislative processes can be. So even when a government has identified market failures and security issues which necessitate intervention, how can we make sure that it is able to respond as quickly as possible in order to address these and reduce the risk to consumers? So the initial 3 security requirements that the government will bring forward and mandates for all consumer connectable products will apply to manufacturers. I'll speak about these in a little bit more detail in the second half of the presentation, but these align to the top 3 guidelines of the Code of Practice for Consumer IoT Security, which the government published in 2018, which was initially voluntary. So these are a ban on universal default and easily guessable passwords on products at the point in which they're made available. It's the mandation of a vulnerability disclosure policy. So at the point in the lead up to this act coming into force, and thereafter, it will be very interesting seeing what those data points look like in Copper Horse's presentation for subsequent publications. And the third security requirement is mandating that there is transparency provided by manufacturers for how long products will be covered with security updates for. In addition to setting out the security requirements that manufacturers will need to comply with, the bill also provides the power to be able to set conditions under which a manufacturer should be able to be treated as having complied with the security requirements. And that is kind of legislative jargon to essentially enable governments to be able to recognize where, as the international standards landscape continues to evolve, emergent standards or emergent international regulatory regimes, such as the European Union Cyber Resilience Act, implements cybersecurity baselines that the government considers to be essentially equivalent to the top 3 security requirements. And in the event that those alternative standards or alternative legislative regimes meet those tests and the government considers it appropriate, we want to make sure that we aren't unnecessarily imposing additional compliance burdens upon industry, and will bring forward regulations that ensure that where a manufacturer has complied with those alternative regimes, that they also don't need to comply with our security requirements when they are essentially the same. Whilst initially, as the regime in the Act is set out, there is a self-assessment process for compliance with the security requirements. As the assurance market for consumer IoT security continues to evolve, the government has the power and maintains the flexibility to be able to mandate different forms of conformity assessment, whether it be third-party conformity assessments, a specific kind of assurance scheme, or whatever the government may deem appropriate in the future. But again, there are no extant plans for any such use of that power. So how will the regime be enforced? So during the passage of the PSTI bill, we announced that the Office for Product Safety and Standards are going to be the appointed regulator. So the enforcement powers that are provided to the Secretary of State within the Act will be exercised by the Office for Product Safety and Standards. They are the government lead organisation for enforcing product safety across all extant product safety legislation. They are also the regulator for the cybersecurity measures for electric vehicle smart charge points. So they are best placed amongst appropriate bodies within government, given they have the ability to zoom out and see how the product safety and product security regimes overlap to enforce this regime. So as I mentioned, the legislation will equip the enforcement authority with the necessary powers, as well as the ability to issue corrective measures, sanctions, and possibly criminal proceedings. What I will stress is that in order to ensure, given the complexity of the tech landscape, as well as the variable security threats that are actually associated with the breach of an individual security requirement, there isn't a link set out in legislation between the violation of a specific obligation or the violation of a specific security requirement and a particular penalty. So the enforcement authority will judge each individual case of non-compliance that it identifies on the individual circumstances that are associated with that breach. It will take into account things like the size of the business in the early stages of the regime, and the impact that the size of that business has had on its ability to comply within the timescales, and also the actual security threat and the impact of each individual breach when determining what the most appropriate corrective or punitive measure is. As is the case for product safety legislation, economic actors will have the right to appeal sanctions or corrective measures that are brought against them. And in terms of transition timelines, the government is committed to a 12-month implementation period for businesses to adjust their business practices. So at some point in the near future, I'm afraid I'm not able to say a huge amount more about when exactly the Act will be coming into force because of all sorts of internal conventions. But at some point in the future, the government will announce that there will be a 12-month transition implementation period for businesses to adjust their business practices, and that after that period, the Act will be coming into force. And for at least the duration of that 12-month period, the actual secondary legislation that sets out the security requirements, alongside various other things, including the accepted products, will be made available in order to ensure that businesses have the information they need in order to ensure their compliance at the point where the Act comes into force. So all of this is intended to protect citizens, networks, and infrastructure from harm, enable emerging tech to innovate, grow, and flourish by improving society and increasing consumer confidence, adopting a proportionate approach without compromising effectiveness, and continuing to protect citizens, networks, and infrastructures from harm in the face of an uncertain future. So I will very quickly move on to talk briefly about the initial security baseline that we're intending on mandating through secondary legislation. The secondary legislation that my team is currently developing within government at the moment won't have any surprises in it. Everything that the government has said about what the PSTI Act product security regime will contain, if it's not in the Act, it's going to be within the regulations. So that's going to be the security requirements. It's going to be conditions for deemed compliance, initially based on the specific provisions of ETSI EN 303645 and the ISO standard on coordinated vulnerability disclosure that initially will be considered when certain conditions are met to be equivalent to implementation of the security requirements. It will also include some technical provisions around the statement of compliance that has to accompany products that are made available. So this is information to be included within the statement of compliance and how long manufacturers and importers have to retain the statement of compliance, as well as details of the products that will be accepted. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this is PCs, laptops, desktops, medical devices, vehicles, smart EV charge points, smart meters. I've gone too far. So the initial security baseline, as I mentioned, is going to have 3 requirements in it. So these are all derived from provisions within ETSI EN 303645, so the ETSI European standards. And these provisions themselves were based on provisions within our Code of Practice for Consumer IoT Security. Provisions 5.1.1 and 5.1.2 from the EN will be wrapped up within the first security requirement, so a ban on universal default and easily guessable passwords. This, alongside all of our requirements, will apply to manufacturers of products. So this is the only one which is a technical product requirements. The other 2 were organizational actions. And this will apply to the hardware of the product as well as software which is pre-installed. The second security requirement is mandating that manufacturers publish information on how to report security issues, as well as ensuring that they publish information on timelines by when people who submit vulnerability reports can expect to receive updates on things like the resolution of the issue. This will apply to the hardware of the products as well as software which is pre-installed. In certain instances, it will also apply to software which is not necessarily on the device itself, but which is associated with the device. So as we mentioned in our call for views and call for views response, the security requirement 2 as well as security requirement 3, they apply in certain conditions, not just to the physical hardware, but also to software which is associated with the operation of the device and associated with the manufacturer's intended functionality for the device. So essentially, software which any given user of products is not going to be able to escape interfacing with when using the products, where there are vulnerabilities within those pieces of software, whether or not they're installed on the product at the point where it's made available to the customer, or whether or not it's actually ever installed on that product. Then in conditions that will be set out in the secondary legislation, they will be within scope of the security requirement to mandate the publication of information on how to report security issues, as well as the requirement to publish information on minimum security update periods, which is the third security requirement. So this is based on ETSI EN 303645 revision 5313. And again, as I mentioned, it applies to hardware, software pre-installed in the product, as well as installable and non-local software, with a small nuance, which is that it will apply to software which is securely updatable. There are other provisions within the EN which mandate that all software on a product be securely updatable. At this stage, the government doesn't think it's proportionate to mandate that element of the EN, but as I mentioned, the powers within the Act are broad enough in order to enable that requirement or other requirements in the future, where appropriate, also to be mandated. So that's a very quick overview of the kind of technical basis of the initial security baseline. I'm now going to close by setting out why the government thinks it's proportionate to introduce these requirements and not others. So to improve the cybersecurity of consumer collectible products, it essentially requires manufacturers of these products to be aware of vulnerabilities that affect the products that they are selling and manufacturing, and making sure that they are appropriately incentivized to address vulnerabilities and implement security measures. These are broadly the market failures that the government has identified, which has convinced it that legislative action is necessary. Because of the market failures of information asymmetry, whereby customers and consumers don't always necessarily have information about how secure a product is, even though we have evidence to suggest that they value security and take that into consideration when making a determination of which product to purchase, it's difficult for that value that they have for the security of a product to actually make a difference to the extent to which manufacturers value security, because if they don't have the information about how secure a product is, how can the preference they have for secure products drive their purchasing decisions? Additionally, if manufacturers don't have vulnerability management systems, the only vulnerabilities they're ever going to discover for products are ones which they encounter internally. And so in the absence of having a means by which they can receive reports of vulnerabilities from security researchers, how can they even know about those vulnerabilities in order to be able to identify them? So These are broadly the market failures that the government is planning to address through the implementation of these initial 3 security requirements. It's, as I mentioned earlier, on the theme of the difference between the timescales through which the threat landscape evolves and the timescales over which legislation is developed. The government doesn't consider it appropriate or feasible for legislation to be a means by which every individual egregious vulnerability can be addressed, affecting multiple different product classes. That would always result in the government and industry playing catch up. And ultimately, manufacturers are best placed to be aware of the specific network of security issues that affect their products, the extent to which, given the individual use cases of those products, what the materiality is and the impact is of those security vulnerabilities. And with the exception of the universal default password requirement, which addresses a particularly egregious vulnerability, which in the absence of such a requirement can result in devices being recruited to botnets, which can cause significant large-scale harm, as was mentioned in the earlier presentation. Broadly, this initial security baseline is intended by government to incentivize good cyber hygiene amongst IoT manufacturers, and to ensure that the issue of security of these products is taken seriously, and to give them the tools they need and to give consumers the tools they need in order for for industry to be able to play its role increasingly in addressing the security of these products. So I think that's enough of me waffling on. That's the end of my presentation. So I will pass it back to you, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. That was absolutely fantastic. A reminder to everybody that if you have a question, we'll be going to the Q&A section of today's webinar in just a few minutes. But if you do have a question, just wiggle your mouse and the chat option will come up on your screen, and you can put a question in there, and then I'll come to you. You can either ask the question yourself, or I can ask the question on your behalf if you prefer. But just before we do go to the Q&A section of today's webinar, I want to just cover a couple of things that we at IoTSF are doing at the moment, the first of which is chapters. So at IoTSF, we believe that IoT security is a global team sport, and we're encouraging collaboration via chapters. You can read all about IoTSF chapters via IoTSecurityFoundation.org/chapters. And if you think that you'd like to form a chapter in your part of the world, then absolutely fantastic. Please do be my guest. The chapters are run within localized regions and are largely self-sufficient with central support from us here at IoTSF. Chapters determine their own schedule of events and meetings, areas of specific interest, and manage their activity locally via the chapter leadership team. So, as I've mentioned, if you'd like to have a chapter, please get in touch with me if you fancy an informal chat about things. You can drop me an email. It's chris.bennison@IoTSecurityFoundation.org, and I can arrange a call back for you. With chapters, we're actually currently in touch with quite a few people around the world at the moment who are looking to form chapters. So I'd like to give a shout out to those in Sweden, Australia, the USA, specifically Houston, Texas. Also to everybody in India, specifically Delhi, Pune, and Bengaluru. If you'd like to form a chapter, again, it's IoTSecurityFoundation.org/chapters. So this today is the first of IoTSF's monthly webinars. They're happening on the final Thursday of every month. So the next one will be Thursday, the 23rd of February. That's at 9 AM Eastern Standard Time, 2 PM Greenwich Mean Time, 3 PM Central European Time, and 7:30 PM India Standard Time. The topic will be SBOM for the next webinar, and Amnias Phillips of Ambotech will be one of the guests joining us. He'll be familiar to many attending this webinar today as the chair of the Security Chain Integrity Project. Look out for a link to Eventbrite in due course for the next webinar, and we'll look forward to seeing as many of you on that as possible. SBOM is a hot topic. and IoTSF will be publishing new guidance soon, so no doubt there'll be plenty to delve into. For March's webinar, by the way, it's going to be Smart Built Environment Guidance for Facilities Managers. So now we go to the Q&A section of today's webinar, and I'm actually going to kick things off with my own query for Rohan. Rohan, I'd like to ask you, there's so many organizations that are doing things well, but can you give any example that aren't doing things well? Excuse me. Can you give any examples of any organizations that are doing things well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that table I showed earlier with the 34 companies that are passing the 2 threshold tests is probably a good group to look at. But there are also organizations that include things in their policies that kind of go above and beyond the base minimum that you need to do vulnerability, conduct vulnerability disclosure. And there are companies that really engage with the security researcher community. And there are policies that include what's known as a safe harbor clause, which basically lets researchers know that if they do testing on their products or services, that they won't face any legal repercussions. Because that's one of the biggest things that limit people taking part, as security researchers taking part in vulnerability disclosures, sort of fear of legal repercussions. So there are these organizations, I think in the report we outlined LG, but there are a few companies doing it, but the LG has this safe harbor clause. And then there are also companies like Apple that recently brought out a new platform to do vulnerability disclosure through, which just makes the process a bit more seamless. But there are definitely companies out there doing things well. But then, as the report kind of indicates, there are a lot of companies not doing anything at all, which is worrying.
Thanks for that, Ryan. Jonathan, a question for yourself as well from me. How does the PSTI Act interact with the EU Cyber Resilience Act?
Thanks for that, Chris. As the first movers in mandating a minimum security baseline for connectable products, we welcome all international interventions in this space. I mean, I think as you mentioned, Chris, IoT security is a global issue. It's something which no one government in itself can entirely remediate. Compromised smart toothbrush in the US or in Europe or in South Korea can be weaponized and form part of a botnet that can be used to launch an attack against persons or institutions in the UK, irrespective of what the UK government puts in law. This is a huge part of the UK's overall mission in this space, to not just ensure that UK consumers are protected from the insecurities within connectable products, but also to incentivize the uptake of standards the UK government considers to be appropriate, whether that's EN 33645 or how the landscape evolves. In terms of the specifics of the EU Cyber Resilience Act, obviously it's been published in draft at the moment. I don't think it's yet started any of the parliamentary scrutiny that will be necessary for it to become law and actually have an implementation date. We welcome the inclusion of various measures within the Act that are equivalent to the baseline that we're looking to set out, whether that be, as Rohan mentioned, provisions around vulnerability disclosure, or provisions in the space of minimum security update periods. We are conscious that as the Cyber Resilience Act is currently drafted, it seems that manufacturers are obligated to undertake a risk assessment to determine which of the essential requirements that they need to implement. We look forward to seeing, as the measure develops, the extent to which that remains the case, or whether there will be standards that, for example, mandate specific levels of security baseline for specific verticals of products with digital elements. But however that ends up looking when the EU proposals are a little bit more mature, if there are elements of that baseline which can be recognized as being functionally equivalent to what we're doing in the UK, the UK has the power to be able to set conditions for compliance through future regulations to enable recognition of compliance with the CRA as being equivalent to the UK PSTI. But yeah, that's all to come, and we await any further updates from the EU.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Could we go to Daniel Morris? He's got a couple of questions. I think they look like questions for Rohan. Could we have Daniel Morris, if you're ready to ask the question, Daniel?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Hi, Rohan. Loving the plants. Quick question for you. Have you actually surveyed the IoT Security Foundation members? Bearing in mind that, you know, what the foundation aims to do, we are described as the super blue team to help others, and you can help others by leading by good example.
Sorry, could you answer the question again? I missed the first part.
Have you surveyed IoT Security Foundation members to see whether or not they comply with having a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy, and whether that's at the .wellknown/security.txt, which various software tools now actually check and probe and validate the context of that file?
No, we haven't. We haven't surveyed IoTSF members specifically, but I'll definitely bring that up with my boss. I think he'd be interested to hear that idea. Definitely.
Chris, sorry for jumping in. It's John here, John Moore, MD of IoTSF. What I will say is it is included in the research. We don't exclude members. What I will also say is that this is the 5th edition. So we've had some very interesting discussions with members along the way who have said, hey, you missed us out. We had to go back to them, and Rohan, you'll know who I'm talking about. There's been a couple of companies that we went back to and said, well, we see you've got a vulnerability disclosure that you've told us about, but we couldn't actually find it. So can you make it more visible?
Thank you very much, John. Daniel, I think you had a couple of questions, or was that everything?
The other question for Jonathan, I think you may have sort of answered it in passing. I'm interested to know, in terms of updates, does the policy now mandate that manufacturers are going to have to maintain products in the market with secure updates available for a defined period of time? So you mentioned doing a baseline security analysis and then publishing that when presumably the product's going through approval or is just entering the market. But you think back to the early 90s, you know, maybe you buy a TV set and expect it to last for, say, 5 or 7 years. If you now look at a consumer product that you can buy, or the general public can buy as a non-specialist, these things are constantly demanding updates. If there's an Android stack update that they miss, if they're based on that or something else, the product will actually stop functioning, or will function insecurely and could be added to a botnet.
Thanks for that, Daniel. And thank you for raising those points, all entirely valid. I think, so what I will say is that the initial security baseline, based on the evidence that we gathered through the consultation and call for views exercises for the PSTI Act, will initially only mandate provision 5313 of EN 303645, which is around manufacturers being transparent about the period for which updates will be provided, and necessarily as a legislative intervention at this stage, that will be essentially mandating that manufacturers provide that figure at the point at which the product is made available to customers. At this stage, it doesn't mandate, for example, that a specific minimum period of time be that length of security update, although obviously we are keenly watching how the EU CRA evolves as it goes through. I think that mandates a minimum of 5 years over which products need to comply with the manufacturer's assessment of which requirements it needs to comply with, or the expected lifetime of the product, whichever is shorter. It's one of many things that we will continue to assess, as well as compliance with the requirements of our initial regime as things go forward. But at this stage, the transparency requirement is what we are bringing forward. Our expectation is that because of the evidence that we have about how much value that consumers place in the security of their products, them having the information they need in order to be able to determine which manufacturers are taking security seriously will be sufficient to drive market change and to incentivize better security practices from manufacturers, including potentially lengthening security update periods and as well as the quality of the security updates over that time.
We don't have much time left on the webinar, so I'm going to try and get through a few more questions quickly. Can we get Paul Piarni? Where's Paul?
Yeah, hi. Right. Okay. Hi both. This question is sort of directed, I think, to you both. It's bearing in mind the large number and sort of variety of software products and of IoT products and manufacturers and the companies that they're based in. How practical is it to detect non-compliance across the majority of that manufacturer base? So Rohan may be able to comment a bit on if they noted, say, how long it took Copper Horse to check whether the vulnerability disclosure was in place.
Happy to answer the first part of the question, Paul. I mean, market surveillance of all product legislation is a challenge, but it's a challenge that governments, certainly the UK government, has faced for a while, certainly in the sphere of product safety. You're absolutely right that there's a significant variety and scale of products that are within scope of the government's intentions for the PSTI Act with concerns to security. But all of those products are also subject to product safety legislation, including significantly more products that aren't connectable. And the government has an extant, long-lasting and robust product safety regulatory regime and has defined and refined its market surveillance practices over the duration of that regime. And this is one of many reasons why actually we think there is no better authority to enforce the legislation and be responsible for detecting and surveilling compliance with it than the Office of Product Safety and Standards, who is already responsible for product safety, and they will be receiving obviously additional funding that is sufficient for them to be able to carry out an additional role in security. But this is the important point, that we aren't setting up an entirely new body in order to surveil product safety. We will be leveraging the tools and techniques that are already used in market surveillance for detecting safety breaches in products for product security.
Thanks.
Folks, a quick reminder, by the way, that this has been recorded and this will be uploaded to YouTube at some point next week. On behalf of Jonathan, how did DCMS, how will you define easily guessable passwords? It was security requirement 1.
It's an interesting question because we've been doing a lot of thinking about how that provision within the EN and the surrounding documents. So what I will say is that there is already work that's been done through the development of the EN itself and the guidance documents that accompany it, as well as the technical specifications that have been produced that set out in a little bit more detail what is and isn't considered to be an easily guessable password. I can't, there are things that I wish I could say about what's going to be in the secondary legislation, but because of where we are in the development process, I can't share it without it necessarily changing over time. But essentially, if you look to, I would say that if you looked at other government interventions that have already mandated this provision within the EN, so this is 512 that we're talking about. This is specifically the electric vehicle smart charge point regulations. That already sets out in a little bit more objective detail how something can or cannot be determined to be easily guessable. So things like being derivable from product identification information, being derivable from publicly available information about the manufacturer or the product. Those are the kinds of things you might expect to see in a legal text that implements this specific requirement of the EN.
Thank you. I don't think we're going to have time for many more questions. Chris Lowe, I think you're chomping at the bit. I'll come to you in a moment. I'm going to read out a comment from Amyas. Awesome regulation, by the way. I wish all government worked so well. There's also a comment asked as a question, but I don't think we'll have time to ask it anyway. But Jason Blake, an accreditation scheme that ensures minimum baseline security standard would surely be beneficial. Can we have Chris Lowe, if you're still available?
Sorry, I wasn't expecting to speak. Hello. Yes, thank you very much. Epic presentations. Rohan, Jonathan, seriously, amazing stuff, and great introduction there, Chris Bennison. It's really good to see that the secondary legislation is coming through, though, of course, the timescales are going to be dependent, and I imagine this is going to be a nightmare task because of the massive convergence of a changing landscape and something which is going to have to last for some long period. I don't envy your task here. Regarding that, I understand also that you won't be able to answer many questions about that secondary legislation, given the fact that it's a work in progress. But one specific question: how can we influence that? How can we chime in order to shape that, to make sure that it's going to be fit for purpose? How can we get involved in the review and make contributions to the secondary legislation so that it's going to be as good as possible?
An entirely understandable question based on the way that I've framed the secondary legislation development process on this call. One thing that I probably should have clarified is that we are making secondary legislation not because at the point where we developed the Act, we didn't know what the secondary legislation was going to contain. It's more a function of needing to make sure that elements of the regime that are likely to be a little bit more protein and changeable over time are in the most appropriate part of the overall legislative regime. So the kind of framework and regime that government consulted on through the call for views in 2020, as well as the consultation before, were the way in which the government has engaged with not just manufacturers, importers, distributors, but also IT security experts, as well as clearly in the development of the initial code of practice, which this is essentially putting provisions of within a statutory footing. So there hasn't been any changes in policy since those consultation exercises. of what the government announced about what it was doing on the other side of the call for views and the call for views response remains what we are doing, and elements of that were not in the PSTI Act are going to be in the secondary legislation. So it's to that extent, the contents of the secondary legislation is static. The process that my team are going through at the moment is more ensuring that language used that is appropriate for standards is translated in a way that is appropriate for UK legislation, and making sure that we go through all of those kind of conventions and hurdles, as opposed to there being necessarily open questions about wider policy questions. Obviously, in the event that there was emergent evidence that it was appropriate for government to bring forward future security requirements, that in itself would be subject to its own consultation exercises, and we would absolutely value the contributions of IoTSF members as well as the wider cybersecurity community in shaping those.
I'm going to have to wrap it up there, I'm afraid. Sorry, Chris. Obviously, there's a lot more questions as well coming in for both yourself, Rohan, and Jonathan. But I think we're going to have to get you guys back further down the line, because obviously there's a lot to discuss with you both. But thank you very much, gentlemen, for this webinar today. Both absolutely fantastic presentations. Very grateful to you both. Just to wrap up today, so look out, as I said at the start of today's webinar, for the first of IoTSF's monthly newsletters, which will be coming soon. If you've not signed up to our mailing list, do drop me an email. It's chris.bennison@iotsecurityfoundation.org, and I'll get you added to our mailing list. If your organization isn't an IoTSF member, you can join today via iotsecurityfoundation.org/join, because I know a lot of people watching today aren't members. As I've mentioned a few times, this webinar has been recorded. It will be on YouTube. I know that a lot of people were late in joining, but you'll be able to see the whole of today's webinar in its entirety. Thanks again to Rohan and Jonathan for joining us today. Also, thanks to my colleagues Jenny, Palm, John, and all of the team at the office as well. We'll be back again, as I mentioned earlier, with SBOM as the topic. That's on Thursday, the 23rd of February. So look out for the Eventbrite link for that one. Wherever you've been watching from today, thank you very much for joining the webinar. My name's Chris for IoTSF, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.